Luckily, this year we did have a very wet year, and a lot of the dams, as you alluded to, a lot of the reservoirs are full, or in some of them even over capacity. We're starting to see those generation resources ramp up and provide a lot more power to us, which in turn is a cost savings because, again, we're paying the operation and maintenance costs no matter what. So the more power that they can generate, that means it's going to be cheaper for us and in turn our customers.
Welcome back to DAM, the official podcast of Northwest Hydropower. I'm your host, Austin Rohr, and I manage all things communications here at Northwest River Partners. At the time of recording today's episode, I find myself in between two road trips down to Northern California to do some camping, enjoy the outdoors, and also attend something called the Hangtown Classic, an iconic national motocross race held outside of Folsom. See, prior to taking up my role here at River Partners and becoming a janky podcast host, I was an editor at a motocross magazine based in Southern California. During my 2 years there, I traveled a lot for work, and I also made several trips back home to the Northwest via I-5 and Highway 395. One particular trip home led me through Redding and Shasta just after a devastating wildfire, and I have vivid memories of looking out at the scorched trees and long, dry shorelines of the reservoir. I hadn't seen anything quite like it, and despite my only connection to this place being those brief moments along my journey that I drove through the area, I felt some sense of sadness seeing it in this way. Fast forward to just a week or so ago when I actually camped near Shasta and later at Lake Folsom, and I was shocked to see the reservoirs in a state I'd never seen them in before. They were full. Of course, I shouldn't have been shocked because California saw arguably too much snow and rain over the past winter and spring. And this got me thinking. The Northwest isn't just Oregon and Washington. In fact, we represent Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Nevada, and yes, California. Our members are spread out all across this region. So I reached out to our neighbors in Northern California to get the scoop on the state of energy and hydropower down there to satisfy, quite frankly, my own curiosity and explore a subject that hopefully you, the listener, will gain something from as well. So, joining me today to tell that story is Nick Dominguez of Lassen Municipal Utility District. Nick, thanks so much for coming on.
Hi, Austin. Yeah, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here and happy that you would invite me to talk about these issues.
Absolutely. The first thing we'll start off with, I was thinking about it as I was putting together today's podcast. I've driven through the area. I'm fairly familiar with your area, but I'm not sure that I know how to pronounce it correctly. Is it Lassen or Lassen?
Yeah, it's Lassen County, and I hear it both ways, so thanks for asking.
Well, I appreciate having an actual official, local insight into that one. And hopefully everyone listening now will get the memo that it's Lassen. Could you describe your role there? What exactly do you do with the utility?
Yeah, so I'm the business manager for Lassen Municipal Utility District. I've been in this role for about 2 years, and I basically just manage all of the business related affairs. So customer service department, IT, public relations, accounting, anything other than operations.
And how exactly did you end up in that role?
Yeah, so that's a little bit of an interesting one. So I started at Lassen Municipal Utility District 10 years ago as an IT technician. So I was brought on to kind of bring all of their IT needs up to where they needed to be. And in that role, I did a lot of work in all of the departments, working to implement new technologies, things like outage management, AMI, SCADA, new customer service systems. So at one point, I was promoted to IT manager, managed all the IT systems, and more recently realized that I kind of had my feet in everything. And so, I was like, okay, well, I know a little bit about everything. This is maybe a good opportunity for me to now manage this stuff since I understand. And so that's how I got here.
Oh, that makes perfect sense. It kind of brings up a thought for me, which is, we have some friends, this organization called the Northwest Public Power Association, or NWPPA for short. And actually, the way I was connected to Lassen is through NWPPA and their communications conference, which they hold annually. It's called the NIC. And so one of the things that happens there on a regular basis is there's this discussion around, how communications people are able to move into sort of managerial roles within utilities because uh, being in comms, you kind of do the same thing, right? You're learning everything about how the utility works, maybe not on a very deep level, but you have to have this sort of inch deep, mile wide understanding of how the entire thing works. And it sounds like it's a similar thing for you in IT.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially in a small organization, maybe in a larger organization, you might have different IT folks that are dedicated to certain things. But we're so small that really, in my IT role, I was having to do a little bit of everything.
And could you touch on maybe the size of the utility there? I mean, just in terms of you know what things look like. I mean, we've had a lot of different folks on the podcast from fairly large utilities to some of our co-ops and things like that. But as a municipal utility district, what kind of territory are you serving there?
Yeah, so we're pretty rural, especially for California. We're not usually you would think of more dense population, but we're pretty rural. So we serve about 11,000 customers, and that's over almost 2,000 square miles of service territory. And so for those 11,000 customers, we have a little over 400 miles of distribution. And we do that all with around 35 employees.
Right, right, and so as far as Lassen County itself, again, as I touched on, I'm somewhat familiar with the area, but for those of us or those who are listening here on the podcast today, our audience that I assume is primarily going to be Northwest based, what can you tell them about where you're located and what it's like there?
Yeah, so even though we're named Lassen Municipal Utility District, we don't serve all of Lassen County. Lassen County is pretty large. So we're on the southern side. We serve Susanville and then the surrounding area. But Lassen County itself is really has a history of logging. It's a very rural, like I said, county. The population of the county itself is about 33,000 people. So it really is I think we probably have more in common with you guys up there in the north than we do with, say, Southern California.
Right, right. I mean, being wooded, having that logging history and also being, primarily rural, it definitely does sound very familiar to a lot of what we've got going on here. But I also understand at the same time from talking to you a little bit prior to today's podcast that, the situation there in California as far as how things go for utilities maybe isn't the same. Could you kind of elaborate on what it's like being a public utility or in your case, a municipal utility in the state of California?
Again, you're going to hear this a lot from me probably, but we're a little bit different than than most people. So we are named a municipal utility. However, I think when most people hear municipal utility, they think of an association with a city or something like that. In fact, we are an independent municipal, so we have our own board of directors that's elected at large by the public, and we have no direct connection to the city or the county. So, all the funds that are collected for the utility stay within the utility. So we operate more like a public utility district, probably more than most people would be familiar with for a municipal. But in general, we have the same challenges that a lot of the community-owned utilities face across the nation, like inflation, supply chain delays, just increasing costs, an aging workforce. All of those things hit us just like everybody else, if not harder, because we're such a small utility. When we have workforce issues, those things are compounded when there's only 35 of us. And 10% of the workforce is nearing retirement or more. That causes issues for us. So in addition to all of that, we have all of the regulatory pressures from Sacramento, and so those types of things pull our staff in a lot of directions, and sometimes can have negative effects on our ability to serve our customers reliably or with affordable power. So maintaining all of those things and doing so in a rural community with a small staff definitely has its challenges.
I can imagine, California is such a large and diverse state. You have rural areas, you have very urban areas. There's, the differences between Southern California, Northern California, the coast, the eastern side with the Sierras and everything like that. I mean, it's a really diverse state, and so regulatory wise, I'm sure there's a lot of challenges there. I can also imagine, as I understand, the way California's utility situation works is there isn't maybe as much public power as what we might be used to here in the Northwest. PG&E covers such a broad territory, and having lived down there, we were within the service territory of SDG&E, which is San Diego Gas and Electric. Um, do you feel that the way that the state recognizes public power is maybe different there as well compared to what we might have in the Northwest?
I think that probably is true. Definitely, in terms of the public as well. Like I grew up in Southern California and lived in Central California as well. And before I started working at a community-owned utility, I didn't know anything about public power. I always paid my bill to PG&E or Edison and didn't think anything about it. So the public really isn't always focused on it, and so that probably means that regulators necessarily aren't focused on it very often. But there's over 2,000 publicly owned utilities across the nation, and only 39 of those are in California. So that maybe answers that question a little better.
Right, right. I mean, it's one of the most populated states, and yet in terms of public power, it's definitely not as much the kind of leading way of delivering energy statewide. So yeah, it certainly makes sense. Are there other challenges unique to your area in terms of what you face? Things that involve kind of the weather challenges, the challenges of being in such a rural area. I imagine that things are fairly unique to your area as opposed to maybe some of the ones that we have around here.
Lassen County is pretty high elevation. Susanville itself, where we're headquartered, is just a little over 4,000 feet. So we have the snow and ice issues that probably a lot of the utilities in the North see. But when you talk about issues related to reliability or power, I think about the Dixie Fire from 2020 that burned in our service territory and had a huge impact on us. Being a rural utility, we're at the end of the line for transmission. Lassen is a distribution only utility, so we don't own and operate any generation resources ourselves. And we're served by a single transmission line that runs through the Caribou Canyon from the west. And when the Dixie Fire came through, it burned that line, and we had 2 weeks of blackouts and brownouts where we were completely isolated from the grid. So we see those issues. The Dixie Fire is an extreme example, but also weather related. If we have snowstorms or things like that that cause issues in the Caribou Canyon, we often have system wide power outages. And being that we don't own or operate that line ourselves, that's PG&E does. We are in communication with PG&E trying to figure out what a restoration timeline looks like. So it could be pretty difficult for us at times.
Well, and wildfire is becoming such an issue really across the nation. I remember when I moved down there, I lived in this area called like Paula Mesa. It was kind of outside of a town called Fallbrook, and we had a fire that struck literally across the highway from the neighborhood I was living in, which was called the Lilac Fire, and it burned through a lot of Bonsall and up into Fallbrook, and it was really devastating. It was red flag conditions, everything like that, and I worked out near the coast, so I had to drive actually towards the way the fire was burning in order to get back to my house and work on evacuation and everything like that. And I remember at the time thinking like this just is not anything I'm familiar with being from the Northwest. This idea of having to really grapple with wildfire and worry about the risks of it was somewhat foreign to me. But since returning back home here now and working in this area and living here again, we've had a lot of wildfire issues, and we've had some really bad situations where even though it didn't necessarily impact the area that I actually live in, even just across the Columbia, I've been able to see the devastation of that fire happening, and the smoke that comes in and fills the area and turns the sky kind of an ominous, apocalyptic dark red and everything like that. And so in some ways, I appreciate you being able to share some of the issues that your utility faces and some of the challenges there, because I think it's something that unfortunately a lot of other areas and utilities are going to have to look to and start to learn from as this becomes more of a common issue.
Yeah, absolutely. You talk about the red sky and probably ash falling in the air, and you can just imagine during that time period when our customers were without power. Usually your doctors are telling you stay inside, use your air conditioning. Well, what do you do when you're in that environment and you have no power? So it was definitely a challenging time for us.
Certainly, certainly, and as you mentioned, not only do you serve a fairly large amount of people overall when it comes to the relative size of the utility itself, but also the mileage, right? I mean, it's something that I've never really, I think, given enough thought to, and it's an interesting thing to explore here today, which is if you're within that service territory of, I think you said like 2,000 square miles, and that whole area loses power. I mean, you're also kind of stranded, right? You're isolated from getting to somewhere that does have power.
Yeah, absolutely. And then we have our resources, our internal resources, like our linemen, their homes are also without power. Their families are living without power during that time period. Exactly when we're calling on them to be available to work on these issues. So it's a struggle. And the Dixie Fire isn't the only one that's affected us. I think up north you had the Bootleg Fire. That affected us in terms of air quality, but also purchase power. We had another fire that came through called the Whaleback Fire, burned a significant part of our line. And when those types of things happen, it is a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. With the Whaleback Fire, we were able to apply for some FEMA grant funds, and then we relocated that power line underground into an area that is more accessible and not prone to wildfires. So if there's opportunity for us to try and reduce that risk, then certainly we take it wherever we can.
I also imagine too that this requires probably an additional level of being kind of equipped to tackle these situations. Whether it's having maybe the appropriate, protective gear for your linemen to go out and work in those conditions, or some of the other, preparations for emergencies that need to be made. I mean, what goes into making it possible for your utility to operate in the face of kind of those dire situations?
Luckily for us, a lot of the things that the linemen need to operate in that environment is part of their day-to-day job. I mean, we don't think about the extremes of the things that they do, but they're out in that environment all the time. When we have outages, the linemen are the ones that are out there trudging through waist deep snow to try and figure out where the fault is. So they're usually pretty well equipped for that. But in times when we have wildfires, we have partners that we work with like Cal Fire or the U.S. Forestry, and usually we're working in tandem with them because if there's something going on, they want to make sure that their workers or their firefighters aren't at risk. And so we're having to de-energize lines in areas where there's active wildfire and things like that. But generally, we try and keep our linemen out of it until it's safe, and then they can go in and clean up afterwards. But they're usually not working in the active fire zone.
That makes sense, certainly. Tying it kind of all together, one of the things that's essential for fighting those wildfires is having access to reservoirs, and those reservoirs oftentimes are associated with hydropower dams. You guys have some hydropower there in the area in terms of what helps serve your utility. But as we were talking about it in preparation for today's podcast, it's certainly a different situation in terms of hydropower's contribution to the energy mix than what we're used to here in the Northwest. To kind of set the stage for that discussion, could you describe to me some of the acronyms that you have there? Because our listeners are probably used to hearing all sorts of acronyms on an energy podcast, and we have a ton here in the Northwest, but they're probably going to hear some new ones today. One of those acronyms that you brought up is the CVP. What is the CVP, and who does that serve?
Yeah, absolutely. We have no shortage of acronyms, so happy to explain them whenever we can. So Lassen MED, like I said, we are a distribution only utility. We have no generation ourselves. So we purchase all of our power wholesale on the market through, I'll introduce another acronym before I explain that one. I'm sorry. Through WAPA, Western Area Power Administration. So Western Area Power Administration is who we purchase all of our wholesale power through, including what's called the base resource. So the base resource is hydropower generation that is generated through the CVP, and the CVP is the Central Valley Project. So way back when in California, somebody realized that there were a lot of resources in terms of hydropower, but they needed to be able to take advantage of them. And so the Central Valley Project was created, and the Bureau of Reclamation and the Army Corps of Engineers worked together with the state to build 11 hydroelectric power plants that produce over or that are capable of producing 2,100 megawatts of power.
And so that hydropower, I mean, it serves you obviously, but I imagine it serves a lot of different folks across the state.
Yeah, absolutely. So they have some type of formula that they use. I'm not sure, how they do it, but they have what are called preference customers. So, as a special district in California, we have a share, or we are entitled to a share of that generation. Tribes are also preference customers. So our local tribe, the Susanville Indian Rancheria, also gets a share of that generation. They actually sign that share over to us because they don't have any way to receive it. So we get a small percentage of that output whenever it's operating. And so all we have to pay really are the operation and maintenance costs that are associated with operating those hydroelectric electric dams.
And here in the Northwest, we often like to kind of tout our abundance of hydropower resources. And while there is maybe in terms of the actual infrastructure a decent amount there in California as well, and certainly in the Central Valley project. Um, you mentioned that the pricing itself and also the amount of energy available from those projects is much more in fluctuation than maybe kind of the constant state that we're so familiar with here. And this ties into kind of that anecdote I shared earlier about the noticeable change at some of those reservoirs that I visited recently. Could you give me the scoop on the up and down price of hydro there, and also the availability of it?
Yeah, absolutely. So California in general has a very boom or bust type cycle for water, and that was one of the reasons for the creation of the Central Valley Project, was to create some reservoirs that would be able to take advantage of the boom and then be able to make it through the bust. And so in the last few years prior to this wet year that we had, we were really in a severe drought, the majority of the state. And so the amount of water that the state dedicated to the CVP was not very much, which in turn means that there was not very much generation happening. And so when there's not very much generation happening, of course, our share of the output of those power plants is not much. We're still burdened with the operation and maintenance costs, regardless of how much power they output. But we have to then go to market through WAPA to purchase that replacement power essentially to serve our customers, and that comes at an additional cost. And luckily, this year we did have a very wet year, and a lot of the dams, as you alluded to, a lot of the reservoirs are full, or in some of them even over capacity, and that means that the state water board allocates more water to power generation. And so we're starting to see now that the runoff is happening from the snow. We're starting to see those generation resources ramp up and provide a lot more power to us, which are in turn is a cost savings, because again, we're paying the operation and maintenance costs no matter what. So the more power that they can generate, that means it's going to be cheaper for us and in turn our customers.
Now, something that we talked about prior to the podcast recording was that it's a bit murky where all the power actually comes from, and it's something that we've also discussed here on the podcast with some of our other guests. Is this idea that you don't really get to choose what energy comes down the transmission line and into your home. We like to sometimes maybe think of things like, oh, I'm receiving X amount of hydropower, or you know, there's sometimes discussions here about, oh, you know, we all of our power goes here or goes there or whatever the case is. But being that we're all interconnected by the grid, that's really not the case. But what you also described is that, sometimes it's hard to even know sometimes where the energy is coming from in terms of what you're receiving from the market side of things.
Yeah, we certainly understand that viewpoint. Even though Lassen MED itself does not own or operate any generating resources, we do. There is a large generating resource here in Lassen County. That's Honey Lake Power biomass plant. I think it's a 30 megawatt nameplate, and 30 megawatts is our grid, Lassen's peak. And so the majority of the time, actually, our system is using all of that biomass power, and then we're exporting it onto the grid. So physically, our customers are using 100% green power, but that's not how it works, right? That power is contracted to San Diego Gas and Electric. So even though it's being generated and at most times used here in Lassen County, it belongs to San Diego Gas and Electric. So California, and I'm sure most states and regulatory bodies have a way of how they want to track this, because, like you said, you aren't purchasing the power necessarily that's coming to your home. That is maybe not who you're contracted to buy with. So there's a lot of contracts and markets and things that happen in the background to try and figure out how much power actually belongs to who, what percentage of it is renewable, what percentage of it is eligible renewable, and then in the end we settle that out with a report to the state at some point, and to our customers to try and get more information to them about where their power is actually coming from.
Right, right. I mean, it's not as simple as, say, you go to the grocery store and you're picking out some produce there, and it's like, oh, today's apples come from Washington State, right? It's a little more complicated than that.
Yeah, absolutely. Although right now, Pacific Gas and Electric PG&E is actually doing some maintenance on the Caribou line. So at this very moment, we are islanded, meaning that our grid is not connected to the electric grid as a whole, and we are solely using the power from the Honey Lake biomass plant. So I'll say that right now, Lassen MUD's green or grid is 100% green, but that's not always the case.
Certainly, certainly, and also too, it does speak to the importance of having options like that. Making sure that there's backup and ways for you guys to continue to be able to serve the folks that you do. Um, you know, Going back to some of those fluctuations, how big of an issue is electricity affordability in the state of California and in your service territory?
I've lived in California my whole life, and so I'm used to it. However, when Lassen MED is a member of Northwest Public Power Association, you mentioned that sometimes we'll travel up to the north to go to a conference or meet up with some folks, and when they hear the price of power in California, sometimes there could be an audible gasp in the room. So currently, Lassen MUD's residential rate for power is 19 cents per kilowatt hour. And to us, that's a good number, because our neighboring IOU, they're closer to 35 cents a kilowatt hour for residential service. California has some of the highest costs for power in the nation. And so even as a public power entity, we have much lower power than our neighboring IOUs. But when you look at it state to state, we probably still far exceed what's in other states.
Certainly, and speaking from personal experience, I think our power bill on average was north of like $500 living down in the San Diego area. And one of the other things that was sort of eye opening is, at in that area particularly, you really can't escape using your air conditioning almost year round. I imagine, knowing California as much as I do, there is a high demand, more year round than maybe some other areas. Here in the spring or in the fall, I look forward to turning off my heat and air conditioning and just kind of letting my place, naturally kind of maintain a comfortable temperature throughout the day and night. But I know that that's not always a luxury that's afforded when you have either high heat or you go kind of from extreme cold to extreme heat and don't get a lot of that in between.
Yeah, our system peak is in the summer, like most of California, but we also have a pretty high peak in the winter as well, and that's because of electric heating. So, we get that in between zone right now. Even though it's June, luckily we're getting some good weather, and our air conditioning load isn't that high, so our customers' bills should be reasonable. But when it heats up, it definitely we see it on the grid.
I would also imagine that given the situation this past winter and how crazy things were there in the winter and springtime, the amount of cold temperatures and just the sheer amount of snowfall that the area saw, there was some of that as well. Things are relatively good now as a result of being able to resupply on some of that water and snowpack and things like that. But what are you guys bracing for in the future?
Yeah, so definitely we're looking towards resiliency and reliability. We expect there to be more of the same, and so we're always looking to see how we can improve those things. We are in the process right now of probably the most ambitious project that the utility has ever taken on, which is a substation interconnection with NV Energy. And so once this substation is complete, we'll have an interconnection with the what they call the Reno to Alturas transmission line, their 235 kV line, and we'll actually be a tie point between two balancing authorities. That's the California ISO and NV Energy's balancing authority. And so for us being able to have redundant power supplies that are capable of powering the whole system is going to be huge and will really help for resiliency and reliability. But of course, that's not the only thing that we're working on. Legislators are always coming up with new challenges for us, and so we're always looking onto the horizon to see what's coming next. NEM 3.0, that's net energy metering, and in California we have to meter and track solar customers certain ways. The state just released new guidance for that. It applies only to the IOUs at this point, but oftentimes what they do is they trial something with the IOUs and then they move it down the line to the POUs later. And so we're tracking that type of stuff. But really our focus is on ensuring we can do whatever we can to provide our customers with reliable and affordable power, and we try our best.
Something that I think people here in the Northwest see, particularly like news headlines, social media, things like that. They see this stuff about, potential blackouts, right? I think the example last year, kind of made the waves in terms of, the state kind of sending out text messages to people or using the emergency alert system to ask people to reduce their power usage, and it was able to avert kind of a crisis. But again, that story really made the rounds. For your particular area, I mean, has that sort of thing, the blackout issue, been a challenge? Obviously there's the wildfire damaging infrastructure component, but then just in terms of general energy usage, do you face any challenges like that?
Yeah, so we pretty much face the same challenges as everybody else in the ISO, in the California's territory, and I think that the balancing authority maybe goes up a little bit into the north as well. So this last summer, we probably were receiving the same alerts that you were. Just in the last year, the California's ISO issued 11 flex alerts indicating that the grid was stressed for power. And in one instance, they put out a press release saying that they were in a grid emergency and notifying operators that they were getting ready to shed load. So we are watching it. We are definitely, we are in the same balancing authority as everybody else, so we have the same struggles, and being able to take on some contracts where we can get local generation definitely helps that. We have some local solar and some new local geothermal generation that's coming online. So the more that we can do that, the more we can rely on ourselves to make sure that we have enough power rather than importing it from somewhere else.
And I know you mentioned when it comes to the hydro side of things, it's kind of you take what you can get when you can get it. Does the recent kind of deluge of snow and rain and everything, and the refilling of those reservoirs, does that provide you with an opportunity maybe to avoid some of those situations using hydro, or do you think that it's still going to really come down to those other resources you mentioned to save the day?
I do think that California is probably going to be in a better position this year. They will release some reports probably coming up about what generation they expect to have online, and so provided that those are all online and operating well, then maybe we're okay. But I don't really have a zoomed out enough picture to be able to see all the generating resources in the state and know if they're going to be online and operable when we hit our peak. And I think that's what the real question is.
And I know you mentioned that there's, those regulatory challenges as well. And one of the regulatory challenges that was brought up was the idea that California doesn't actually recognize hydropower as a renewable energy resource. And when we talked about that prior, it struck something in me that I remembered, that there was something similar here in Washington. And after looking into it, it looks like the state has kind of, scrapped that idea and moved on to trying to really just bolster as much, clean energy and climate, um, climate friendly energy sources as possible. Um, so for your area, looking at that situation, how does that non-recognition of hydro as a renewable resource impact you?
Yeah, so in California, we have what's called the Renewables Portfolio Standard, and that's what guides utilities on how much of their power that they sell needs to be renewable, and it has to be what they call eligible renewable, which means it has to meet certain guidelines set by the state. In 2020, by 2024, we should be 44% renewable. And by 2030, 60% of the power we sell should be considered eligible renewable. But like you said, California does not consider large hydro as an eligible renewable. Small hydro they do, but large hydro they don't. So all of that power that we see coming from the CVP, that base resource, we don't get to count that as a renewable resource. California says that that's not eligible. So what we have to do then to meet these goals, we have to go out into the market and find places to procure this renewable resource. And as you can imagine, it's more expensive. And so customers really see this on their bill as the cost of power goes up. We're trying to fold those renewables, into our mix, but there's going to be an added cost to it.
And you touched on some of those other regulatory challenges as well. Are there other regulatory challenges as a whole that you're kind of up against right now?
Yeah, so like I said earlier, it seems like there's always a new challenge coming for us, and so we use our industry groups that we partner with to try and help kind of watch these things and know if it's something that we need to talk about, and then they can amplify our voice. And so, NWPPA certainly does that in the West for us. We have the California Municipal Utility Association that does that in California as a whole, and then we have some other ones that we work with nationally. But in terms of California and upcoming regulations, right now we're tracking what they call the Advanced Clean Fleet Rule, where they are trying to mandate that all of our commercial vehicles, including bucket trucks and line trucks, all of that stuff, are 100% electric by a certain deadline. And the challenges with that, utilities are coming out and saying, that we can't operate these trucks in extreme environments. That's when they need to be operable. There are no manufacturers that are currently manufacturing these vehicles. They're not even available to purchase. And the costs of them when they are available to purchase are astronomical. So we use our industry groups and partners to take this information and bring it back to legislators and hopefully affect some change so that the regulations that end up coming out of Sacramento or from Washington, D.C. Are a little more meaningful.
Another question that comes to mind as well, when you do have a different mix in terms of having so many IOUs and also having some of those municipalities, public power, and the consumer choice providers. Are you all subject to the same kind of policies, or does the state typically divide that up as far as what what falls on you versus say what falls on a PGE, an Edison, or an SDG&E?
Yeah, so technically, we are separate, and so they have different ways that they refer to us in their regulation. Sometimes we both end up falling under the same umbrella. Oftentimes we're split up, like I mentioned, the net energy metering 3.0 rule that came out. They're applying that to IOUs first, and then they'll probably roll it out to us eventually. But we're governed by our local elected board of directors, and so this provides us, I think, with some amount of local control, as much as we're allowed, basically. But it helps us ensure that the policies that are enacted make sense for Lassen County and for our customers, and so we try and leverage that as much as we can.
So for public power, one of the things that we always try and encourage is for people to get involved, and for the communities who really are, in a sense, the owners of that public power resource to make sure that they're aware that they're not just customers, and that they're not paying into like a corporation, right? I mean, they are, in a sense, truly sharing a piece of the larger pie. Do you feel like the participation from your customers is fairly robust, or is that something that you guys are working to try and get more people in the area involved?
Yeah, that's always a challenge, I think, for public power, and we sort of have to tell our story over and over again for people to understand. And we're working on that now. Lassen MUD has a very compelling local story of people who were tired of being served by an IOU that didn't care for them, and created the municipal utility and took over that IOU so that we could serve our customers. That happened just 1988. That's pretty recent in terms of utility years. And so getting out into the community and telling that story and reinforcing it, I think, is important, because not everybody understands. And like I said, before I moved up to Lassen County and started working for Lassen MUD, I had no idea that public power even existed.
One other thing I did want to touch on as well too is you brought up working a bit with Nevada, and from looking at the map, it looks like you guys actually you border right up against the California Nevada border. I'm curious, we haven't really spoken to any of our friends here, or different folks on the podcast who are geographically in that situation. How does it work in terms of being kind of up against another state border, and having to I imagine kind of balance some things out there as far as working with both Nevada and California?
Yeah, there are certainly some challenges with that, and especially with our interconnection, where we're talking about having an actual physical tie between two different balancing authorities in two different states. And so working with everybody and trying to get everybody on the same page, it's difficult, but it's doable. And if you have the right people in the right places, then they can make sure that all of the contracts are in place and that there are no surprises. We haven't completed that interconnection yet, and so I don't want to speak too soon to say that we're great, and that we're gonna get it done with no hiccups. But at this point, it's looking pretty good.
Well, it is something I definitely wanted to ask you is, despite all these challenges, there is, I imagine, lots and lots of positive takeaways. And one of those, to discuss further is a path forward in meeting some of those challenges. And I'm curious, what do you see as far as Lassen goes, for your ability to kind of rise up to the occasion and tackle some of these things?
Yeah, I think completion of this new interconnection is really going to be a game changer for the utility and the community as a whole. It's going to give us access to more reliable power, redundant power supply, and access to more power markets, which means that we can shop around for more affordable power that meets our needs. And as a publicly owned utility, any cost savings that we're able to realize, go directly to the customer in terms of lower rates. So I think that's what the future looks like for us, and we're on the path, and hopefully within the next couple of years we'll have that interconnection complete and we can start seeing those changes.
And for your community, what are some of the other exciting things going on there, and some of the things that maybe you could share with our audience as well that you could really get excited about if you're part of Lassen, or it's maybe an area that you've got your eye on to go and take a look at.
There's a lot of outdoor recreation here in Lassen, and I think that the city and the community and the county are really starting to understand that that's something that needs to be marketed, so that people who are driving through can stop and enjoy those things. We have trails, miles and miles of trails for running. I'm a trail runner. I love running half marathons, and that's great for me. There's bike riding, there's ATVs, we have lakes, we have all kinds of beautiful things to do in this county. And so as we work to kind of get the word out and get more people attracted to the area, I think that really will help grow this rural community, and we need some growth here.
Certainly, certainly. It's something that, again, I think we might look at California versus the Northwest as like being two different places, but there are so many connections, so many things that we share in common. And as you mentioned, really at the beginning of the podcast, being a sort of a logging based area, it sounds like a lot of that is similar to what we experience here, where these places that previously relied on an industry that's maybe not as strong as it once was. There's a challenge in trying to find ways to move forward now, and find new opportunities to rebuild, and find other economic avenues, and ways to keep that community thriving and moving forward.
Yeah, economic development is top of mind for the community for sure. And Lassen MED is trying to be at the center of that, and we're gonna try and do some things that we hope can maybe drive that, or create a spark for economic development here in Susanville and Lassen County.
Yeah, people think of utilities as being, oh, that's where I get my power from or whatever. But whether it's the businesses that you're providing power to, or just the costs that people are paying in order to access energy, those are really integral to economic development, and making sure that those areas can achieve the goals that they have in mind.
Yes, the safe and reliable power, I think, is something that's necessary for good economic development. And when you have a 2 week outage, that's really not conducive to good business. And so we hope that this reliability project that we're working on will really help to create a foundation for economic development for us.
As we kind of reach the end here. One other question I did want to ask you, just in terms of getting to speak to, again, kind of a heavily biased Northwest audience today. What are some things you'd like our audience to know about Lassen, and about the kind of utility life, and the public power world of California as a whole?
Yeah, I think it's just great for everybody to understand the value of community-owned power. When you're a municipal, or you're a co-op, or PUD, or any form of community power, we all have challenges. And up here in Northern California, we probably unexpectedly share a lot of the same challenges, um, like you guys do up in the north. But we all have a common goal, and that's serving our customers. So I think that we can continue to partner and work together and find solutions, whether they're within the state or across those state lines, when we have challenges that we share.
Couldn't agree with you more. And yeah, I think again, sometimes there seems to be this maybe divide in people's minds of the two areas. But yeah, we've got so much in common. And we're all connected here on the west to the same grid. So we've all got to work together to solve our problems. And yeah, definitely appreciate that perspective. Speaking of sharing perspectives, there's one last thing that we always like to do here on the podcast, and it's to give our guests the opportunity to share a bit of life advice, just kind of off the cuff, not really scripted in or anything like that. I mean, certainly we try and keep the whole conversation as organic and genuine as possible, but particularly when it comes to this one, I like to make sure that it's really spoken from the heart. And it's just a way for our audience to get to really get to experience the human side of things and really, understand you and who you are and your story. So, yeah, if you don't mind, what's a little bit of life advice you could share with us?
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate you not having this scripted so that I could come up with it on my own. But I would say that, uh, really just a continual mindset of self-improvement, is great to have. And, I started my role here as an IT technician. I have a degree in computer science. Never did I think that I was going to be on the business side of things. But, I always wanted to learn. I always, took any challenge as an opportunity. And I'm looking across my office right now, and on my whiteboard, I have at the top, "Be better," and I try and live by that. You can always do better. Never be satisfied with who you are now, because you can always be better in some way. And so I look at that every day, when I'm doing something, and think, can I be doing what I'm doing better?
That's fantastic. No, I love that, and yeah, really appreciate you sharing that, and appreciate you making the time to come on today. I know that it's a bit of a unique situation. We're we're speaking about hydropower and things like that, and you guys are in a different position than maybe kind of our usual guests, but. Really appreciate your perspective and being able to share the story of your area and your utility. And I think there's some really interesting takeaways that our audience is going to gain from this, and it just really adds to the knowledge base for not only everyone listening, but also myself too, and being able to understand kind of the broader energy challenges that we face here on the West.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate the opportunity, and I learned a lot about you guys in the North as well. So happy to be here.
Definitely, definitely, and we'll continue to try and strengthen those connections. So, yeah, thanks for making the time, and hopefully we'll be in touch more.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, it's me again. This time coming to you from the future. Kind of. Technically, this is actually all in the past. Anyways, I'm just now getting back from that second road trip that I mentioned in the intro, if you can remember that far back, which once again brought me to the region of Northern California. This time, though, I was up in the Sierra Nevada mountains for a bit before visiting some friendly folks in Paradise, which I assume many of you listeners have heard of as a result of the devastating Camp Fire that destroyed the town in 2018. Not that any of you really care to hear about my travels, but it did make for an interesting experience seeing the things firsthand just after having my discussion with Nick and getting to learn so much about the area with regards to public power and hydro issues. I also paid visit to a few more reservoirs that were full to the brim, including one that required me to access it via a horseback adventure. And all of that water spoiled my hopes of landing some trout in the Sierras because the rivers up there were as blown out as anyone had seen them in decades. Now, the other reason that this is actually relevant to you specifically is that this podcast and my recent travels have set us up for what I believe is going to be a really great episode in the coming weeks with one of our Northwest utilities and their firsthand experience with wildfire devastation. If you make sure you're subscribed on your current listening platform, you can be sure to catch that one and all future episodes of Damn. But what I really want is to hear from you. What did you learn from today's episode? Are you planning any trips for the summer ahead that might take you past some hydropower reservoirs? You can let us know about all of that and anything else you'd like to share with us, including future podcast guests and topics, by heading to the brand new nwriverpartners.org and filling out our contact form, or by emailing us at info@nwriverpartners.org. You can also connect with us via reviews on your favorite listening platform. All positive reviews contribute to audience growth, and audience growth means you get more episodes of Damn each and every other Friday. Leave us those honest but well-deserved 5-star reviews and positive affirmations, and tap the bell icon to turn on notifications so you don't miss any future episodes, no matter where your own adventures take you this summer. Speaking of your favorite listening platform, because remember I told you I'm a Spotify guy myself, I got an email this week informing me that the Stitcher platform is going away for good. Now, I've never used Stitcher, but we're on there, and it's probably worth sharing this news with anyone who's actively using that app to listen to us. Our condolences go out to all of our Stitcher listeners, and we hope you'll come hang out with us on another platform. This would probably be the perfect spot to drop in that Sarah McLachlan tune. You know, the one from the ASPCA commercials that used to ruin everyone's day in an instant? But seeing as how I'm not all that well versed on copyright laws and music rights for this particular podcast, I'm just going to give you a moment of silence to imagine that or some other sad tune. Still there? Good, because I've got one last thing for you. Visit us at NW River Partners on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn to see what we're up to. And until next time, see ya!